Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Barry Saleho.
On behalf of ICLE Africa,
the African Centre for Cities,
Our Future Cities,
Red Cross Crescent Climate Centre,
and partners,
we're excited to welcome all of you
to the Rise Africa 2022 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing since 2020
as a platform for thinkers,
doers,
and enablers,
committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
This year's theme is
creativity.
For me, this means blending skills to be able to communicate the climate change complexity in rapidly urbanizing cities.
We are walking dynamites of creative expression, whether it be in the arts, in the sciences, or in tech.
There are so many people in the African continent who have a huge skill base and are creative in the way they approach challenges.
Creativity in Africa is about embracing our own. It's about dynamism and it's about embracing our indigenous knowledge.
I think agency is finding ways of giving power back to people, to groups, to young people, especially on a continent where it's a very young population.
One should be taking ownership and the responsibility to create an Africa that they would like to live in, as well as leave behind for the future generations.
I think what agency means to me is change from the ground up.
The importance of urgency is the recognition of the past and the recognition that we've lost time.
Urgency is about acting now to build more inclusive, productive, and resilient cities.
There's this need to creatively redesign and unlearn and explore new ways of thinking.
The festival is hosting 33 sessions
with 135 provocateurs from across Africa and the world.
Every session aims to show new ideas,
showcase ongoing action,
and launch new initiatives, bringing participants together
to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you.
At the festival, we encourage you to showcase your business and projects,
build lasting partnerships,
unleash your creative potential,
commit to sustainable action.
Rise Africa is about translating ideas into action. What actions are you going to commit to this festival?
Before the session begins, it is important to note that you're being recorded.
And by participating, you are given the consent to be recorded.
All recordings will be available on the program page after the festival. Creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities.
And so we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming.
L'Afrique est fatiguée de se retrouver dans l'obscurité. Elle est fatiguée de naviguer contre les courants de l'industrialisation. L'Afrique me dit qu'elle est fatiguée de se reposer au feu du bois. Il est donc temps de faire sauter les compteurs. Éclairons l'Afrique, libérons son énergie pour libérer son potentiel. Accélérons le rythme cardiaque de son développement. Libérons son énergie pour libérer son potentiel. Transformons l'enveloppe énergétique de l'Afrique pour stimuler son développement. Car la nature nous a tellement gratifiés de ses richesses. Changeons l'histoire, éclairons l'Afrique, donnons un bout de lumière à chaque foyer en Afrique est une possibilité. Changeons l'histoire, éclairons l'Afrique. Libérons son énergie pour libérer son potentiel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Petersen. I'm one of the co-conveners of this session. I'm based at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and we are co-convening this particular session with Future Studio based at Utrecht University, but a little bit more on that later. What we thought we wanted to do is to kick off by just asking everyone to, in the chat function, tell us who you are, your name, the organization you're from, what role you might be playing there, and the country, so that we can really appreciate the amazing diversity we've got. I also want to thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. As I'll explain in a second, this is the beginning of a 2-year project, a partnership between Urban Future Studio and ACC. And in this particular partnership are the following collective, and we're hoping to be joined by a few more colleagues over the next few weeks. I'm working with Bella Knermeyer from ACC, and you'll hear more from Martin Heyer, Blake Robinson, and Josie Chambers during the course of this morning. We also want you to keep your smartphone close by, not because we want you to check your tweets and your Instagram feeds while we're talking, but we're hoping to use some of the online tools as a way of involving as many people as possible over the course of the next hour and a half. And you will see, once the screen aligns, there'll be the different handles for social media. So if you feel so moved or inspired to put out any insights across any social media platforms, please use those handles. Now, as I've indicated, I wanted to just share a few words on the partnership between ACC and the Urban Future Studio. And essentially, we are part of an attempt, a very sort of a fantastic opportunity to take some time to think through a set of very specific questions. And as it happened, we realized that Rise Africa was going to unfold at the same moment that we are conceptualizing the project. And so we thought, what an amazing opportunity before we have settled into what exactly we're going to do. We could try and crowdsource, if you will, some learning and insights and a sense of priorities for our project based on the experience of the leaders that will be talking in the session, but also the participants in this group. So we're trying to combine the inputs of the 4 speakers that I'll introduce in a second with a couple of exercises we will run where we will try and get some ideas from you. The focus of the work is we're trying to figure out how do we bridge the chasm between where our cities are going in the context of rapid urban growth and a compounding of pressures, and, if you will, the emergence of the last decade or so of a set of political policy agreements that acknowledges we've got to deal with some of the most pertinent and pressing challenges facing the continent, of which arguably economic development that is labor intensive is probably the most important, but also a form of economic development that can take place within environmental guardrails, within environmental constraints. And more importantly, a form of development that can deal with incredible inequality across various domains in African society. And we think that there's something to be explored about the role that Africa's cities, and specifically the investment in infrastructure, can play in catalyzing or responding to some of these challenges. And so this opens up an African conversation that's part of a global debate about what is sustainable infrastructure, how do we transition from the incumbent systems to something that is different, and how do we use emergent experiments with alternatives, with innovation, and so on, as an informant for that inquiry. And so we've structured today to help us to learn from 4 practitioners who we think are doing incredible work. And we want to use that as a provocation to try and have at least one conversation today about what the priorities for our inquiry should be. How should we think about sustainable infrastructure transitions, and what kind of innovation ecosystem can support that? So as we sort of, before we get into the substance of this, I wanted to just, Blake, is the agenda somewhere? Is it gonna, I'm not sure if I'm seeing the right screen or not. Maybe my view thing isn't right. Yeah, okay. So, okay, Blake is trying to do something there. Blake, are you sharing the agenda? Otherwise, I'll just go through it. Yeah, there we go. So maybe don't put it full screen, because then it goes off the for some of the reason. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I can't see the slide properly. Maybe it's just me. Yeah, okay. So it's fine. That's fine. I could see it now. I just changed the setting for size on my thing. You want to just put it back up, please? Thanks, Blake. So the way we've structured it is to do a quick exercise that Blake will facilitate, and I'll introduce him in a second, and then I'll say a little bit more about what we mean by sustainable infrastructure. And then we'd like to hear from you what you think the most urgent or the most critical priorities are to focus on. And we're hoping to take some of the insights from that to help us think through how we plot our own research and inquiry over the next 2 years. We'll then have these inputs from the speakers, and we've asked them, they're all incredibly accomplished and they've done amazing things. And so we are torturing them a little bit. We're asking them to condense their wealth of experience to 5-6 minutes so that we can have ample time for discussion from the audience and engagement. And then we'll conclude this afternoon. So without any further ado, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. The turnout is incredible and we're really appreciative of your time. And I'll hand over to Blake.
Thank you, Edgar, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be joining you this afternoon from the Urban Future Studio in the Netherlands at what is my first Rise Africa Action Festival. And before we start with the agenda today and some really interesting speakers from all over the continent, we thought we'd start with a creative exercise in line with the theme for today, which is creativity. So we'd like you to imagine the future of your city, whether this be an African city that you live in or one that you are very familiar with. We'd like you to think about the daily life of somebody in 2 generations' time. So for those of you with young kids, it might be your grandchild when they reach their early 20s. Think about where this person wakes up and what their morning routine might be. Think about how they get to where they need to be that day and what their experience is in moving through the city. Think about what they might be doing during the day and the people they interact with. When they walk through the city or move through the city, what is their experience of the city center? When they leave at the end of the day, what is their commute like? What do they do after work? Who do they see? And how do they go to sleep at the end of the day? We can never really know what the future is going to be like, but a lot of the clues for the future lie in the present. We'd now like you to, now that you have a vision for what a day in the life of somebody in the future might be like, to think about how you would describe that city in the future. So we're going to use an app called Menti to gather some of your thoughts as to how you would describe that city. Remember, this is the city that is probable, how you imagine your city will be in the next 2 generations. So you will see on your screen a QR code. For those of you with smartphones, you'll be able to access the link via the QR code. And those of you who don't have, you can visit menti.com and enter the code on the screen. Josie will also paste a link in the chat in case you're struggling with any of those. So you'll have an opportunity to enter up to 8 words, and please scroll down to the bottom to click the blue submit button when you're ready. We'll give you about 1.5 minutes to enter your words. So remember, these are words describing what you think your city is likely to be like in 2 generations' time. So we can already see some responses starting to come through on the Mentimeter. Some people are thinking that the city will be similar to what it's currently like. The mention of busyness, inequality, nature or eco-friendly. Mad Max meets Kafka, interesting one. Energy security, people-centered, friendly, functional, ultra-modern, expensive, splintered, crowded, polluted, informal, congested. As you can see, there are a number of different ways in which we can think about the future of cities, and none of them are cast in stone. When we think about visions of future cities, we think about things like billboards for large skyscrapers that are going to be built in the city. We can think about new developments like Konza Technopolis or the Eco-Atlantic development in Nigeria. We can think about climate forecasts that tell us what's likely to happen with sea level rise or temperature, or population growth forecasts. We think about the smart technologies that people are trying to promote as a way to make cities more user-friendly through data. There are a number of different visions for the future, and each are prepared with different agendas and different ways of seeing the future. And yet we all have a stake in how that future can be. When we were preparing the registrations for Rise Africa, we asked people to prepare their vision for what a future city could be like. And you'll see that many of these same terms came through. What's not surprising is that sustainable came through as one of the top themes, as ICLEI was the organizer focusing on sustainable cities, but also terms like inclusive, safe, green, and clean. There are a number of more societal terms like just, equitable, healthy, accessible, and affordable, and also terms relating to the aesthetics of the city like beautiful, greener, or attractive. There were also terms relating to how the city fits relative to the rest of the world, like best and world-class. As you can see, there are a number of different visions as to what our cities could be like. In general, there's a positive view when thinking about what people would be like, what the cities would be like, and we have choices that we can make today that affect that future. In this project that Edgar introduced earlier, we're looking at how we can bridge the gap between possibly negative visions of what our future cities could be like, to see how we could create these more sustainable, inclusive, safe, green, clean, resilient cities. We believe that infrastructure is key to this change, and Edgar is going to present now on the role that infrastructure could play in achieving these more sustainable future cities. I'll hand over to you, Edgar.
Thanks, Blake. Let me just get the slides up and see if we can make this as seamless as possible. Great, thanks. And yeah, so Blake, so that cloud was in real time? Because yes. I had pretty bleak things and I only saw very positive things. And my bleak things were cancelled out by the number of positive things. Anyway, maybe what I'll say next will give a bit of context. So of course, everyone knows the big story. We're going to treble our urban population in just the next 30 years. We're now at about 520 million urban dwellers on the continent, and that will get close to 1.5 billion over the next years. And the drivers of that will be mainly in West, Central, and East Africa because of where they are in the urban transition. Now, typically, of course, you know, the development agencies have always been very happy when urbanization happens because it tends to be associated, historically at least in other world regions, with higher income, better educational attainment, and increased productivity of both labor and private sector firms. And if you have urbanization combined with a growing labor force, wow, that is, you know, that's the golden goose. The problem is that based on current evidence, it is not at all clear that for the African continent, the confluence of these two trends is in fact going to be the accelerant that we're hoping for. It might very well have the opposite impact. And why is that the case? The reason is that we kind of funneled in a very particular way that, yes, we've got this very large and growing youthful population. The problem is that more than 80% of them are in informal or precarious employment. And so what that means practically is that they've got very low wages, it's irregular, and of course, most African governments don't really have any form of social protection. And so there's no safety net that can catch these potentially incredibly productive people. So due to this, the only viable option that's available to this generation that is structuring our cities is to live informally or to live in slum conditions. That is not a preferred, it is just the only hustle that's available. So what you see as a result of that, because of the limited access to basic services in those conditions, is that you've got the intersection of low wages, health challenges, and then of course the overlay of both climate and economic shocks. And what we've seen as we've lived through COVID over the last 2 years, and as the Ukrainian war is impacting on the availability of wheat and other staples for food security, we now see this normalization of large-scale injustice and inequality. And these are structural drivers that are very, very difficult to shift, but also what has very much been part of the discussion at the policy level. So if one has to stylize the challenges, at the moment, most of the proactive policy that is made and investment into urban areas tends to cater, if we're generous, for the top 20% of the urban population. And it tries to prioritize attending to the service delivery and the mobility needs of that middle class. That is combined with a tendency to criminalize informal livelihoods, whether these are informal traders or people that are building structures to live in. And of course, we see inevitably a lack of adequate basic services because we just don't have the investment in shelter, public infrastructure, and social development opportunities, particularly education and health. And so this great potential is in fact not being actualized because we're not putting in the necessary investments. And then on the political level, what we've seen is the emergence of this governance vacuum to coordinate the necessary investments to optimize urbanization. And the reason for that is that there's been very little appetite outside of South Africa and parts of North Africa, and a few exceptions in East Africa, to really give substance to democratic decentralization. So this is, a very simplified picture, but it just gives us a sense of some of the macro challenges that we face. So the broad response has been, we've got to get the economy right. Agenda 2063 and all of the various action plans that flow from that, like the Common African Market, the Common Passport, the Open Skies policy, increasing the level of intra-Africa trade and so forth, that is all aimed at getting African economies out of the bind of either being dependent on a single commodity or predominantly exports of primary commodities and so on, and to really think carefully about how does one calibrate investment in essential infrastructure with driving up growth, but a form of growth that is employment intensive and within environmental limits. And so we've seen really significant expansion of macro thinking through UNECA, through the African Union, through the NEPAD program, and so forth over the last decade in particular. And it is only recently that they're recognizing most of that is in fact landing in urban areas. So what we've seen in the first generation of this investment is an obsession with corridors, with new towns, and with export processing zones. The problem with that is that it's often failed to engage or put cities at the center of that thinking. So it's kind of been a non-urban infrastructure agenda with a pan-African spatial imaginary, which is all kinds of challenges. Of course, as we've seen in the global north with the Build Back Better campaigns and sort of the Green New Deal and so on, that the promise of infrastructure investment is that on the one hand, you could potentially see the fulfillment of socioeconomic rights, which of course has been entrenched in Africa since 1981 with the adoption of the African Charter, and that it can potentially accelerate structural transformation in the direction of green industrialization. And it is at the intersection of those two things that we think sustainable infrastructure can play a particularly powerful role. And this also resonates with global thinking in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement, the SDGs, and so forth. And so when we just extrapolate from all of those frameworks, what Goal 11 might mean in terms of various domains of policy reform that has to happen in an interactive way, this is the kind of menu that we are talking about. Sustainable infrastructure in tandem with a green building agenda. And both of those things, of course, cannot happen without radical reform of planning, zoning, and various institutional regulations. That in turn, and this is for another day, but as part of the broader inquiry that we're thinking about, is has to be premised on a more fundamental philosophical and theoretical rethink of the paradigm of property rights and property ownership that is the dominant norm at the moment and tends to structure real estate economies. And there the work is to take this perspective of the fundamental nature of ecosystem services and rethink this question of property and ownership in a fundamentally different way for a climate constrained and an environmentally constrained and highly unequal world. What do those things mean? We're also thinking about a very different kind of politics where there'll be a lot more. We've seen the emergence of the climate movement, the climate emergency movement, and so on. But it's clear that at the urban scale, we would need different kinds of coalitions that stretch across the different domains of society. So yes, partnerships, but also coalitions. And then, of course, I guess Africa is testament to the fact that digital platforms can be catalytic and transformative in a really profound way. All of that all has implications for multi-governance. Now, we can't go into all of that today, but we just thought it's important to recognize that there's a broader frame. Our interest today is really on these two aspects here. And to some extent, the work in Accra is more on this building retrofit side, creating the kind of spatial context within which innovation can emerge, but we'll hear more about that later. So this inquiry builds on work we've started a couple of years ago, and in 2020 we ran a year of webinars called Reframe, and that was premised on trying to wrestle with this idea of sustainable infrastructure. And we tried to come up with a fairly obvious working definition, which reads as follows. Infrastructure is defined as the stuff that make a country, a city, or settlement function optimally. It includes operating systems and equipment to conduct energy, the movement of people, goods, data, and services, as well as water, sewage, and waste. Modern life is simply impossible without it. Sustainable infrastructure fulfills the same functions, but it deploys technological systems that are low or zero carbon intensive, resource efficient, employment rich, and generative of diverse social and ecological systems. And what we've done is to take this working definition and translate it into a set of criteria. But when we bump into sustainable infrastructure on the road, will we recognize it? Will we know what we're talking about? Will we know what we see? And so this is a working list. It's not meant to be exhaustive in any way, but I guess it's the minimum threshold for something that makes sense in the context, the specificities of the African context. So obviously low carbon, which includes materials efficiency, labor intensive and generative. And the next point is maybe less concrete, but absolutely critical and connects to ideas about decentralization and distributed systems, but this idea of circulating value and rebuilding social and community cohesion on the basis of this internment of value. As I've mentioned before, digitally enabled, and critically, we cannot escape the problem of spatial inequality in our cities. And so how to think about spatially efficient and just forms is vital. So a possible way of thinking about this then is we've got to, in a way, build a new economy, which is premised on the ideas of circularity and care. And then we can begin to see how it's possible to rethink the entire value chains of different infrastructure sectors. And infrastructure here is obviously defined in the broadest possible way to include both physical, network, and social and natural infrastructure systems. Now, the idea is that we've got to co-produce indigenous models within these generic principles. So this is why we've structured this afternoon in this way, because the folk that are speaking are deeply engaged with their local context. And we want to, if you will, think within these principles, but in relation to specific sites, so that we can really get to the nitty-gritty. So any innovation that is clear in our context has to figure out what an alternative might involve when you connect formal and informal systems. This is just, we can't avoid this. So we don't have the luxury of just thinking of formal retrofits or introducing new technologies where you've got a formal economy and a tax base. Those things don't exist in the same way. Secondly, of course, you can't just jump from the one condition to the next. So you invariably talking about messy and often sticky transition processes. So that means we have to think about deliberate spaces for testing alternatives where we can fail successfully so that we can begin to decipher what might be sufficiently robust to be able to get traction and to become mainstream. But you can't do that if you can't learn from those experiments. So you need a step of codification, which of course is the interest of Utrecht and ourselves as academic institutions committed to transforming the world. And so there's a question about creating the knowledge bases to be able to mainstream. So on the back of that, allow me to introduce our amazing panel today. They won't speak immediately. Blake will take us through another exercise, but I just wanted to explain a little bit the context. So they won't speak in this order, but I'll just go through it. So we've got William Senio from the Impact Hub in Accra, and he's in fact the co-founder and the CEO of the Impact Hub. And their mission is to build a precinct, also Aku Ajay, which will become an innovation district and a nerve center for both entrepreneurs and bold thinkers. And we think there's something really powerful about thinking about a new kind of business in the African context in relation to the social impacts we're talking about. And so we've invited Will to share some of his experiences, learning and challenges with us today. Then we have Regina Apondo, who is the Senior Community Principal at the Konki Design Initiative, and they have offices in Nairobi in Kenya, but they also have a presence in Europe and the US. And their commitment is really to use community-driven transformation of public spaces through partnership, capacity development, advocacy, networking to create a new kind of infrastructure, if you will, collective infrastructure that aggregates various facilities for basic needs like water and sanitation with green infrastructure and open space. Then very similar to that kind of work, we have Michael Uemendimo from CMAP. CMAP is a short collaborative. In that context, he oversees what is they call the Human City Project. This is a community-driven media initiative exploring design processes through which violent communities might gain greater ownership over their representation. Finally, South African.
Edgar, your sound is just cutting out for us. I'm not sure if your microphone is moving around or.
Nothing is moving except my head. Okay. Sharing, maybe it's easier to follow me if you can lip read.
Seems to have improved. Thanks.
That improved. Okay. I have no idea what happened there. Our last speaker, and we are so grateful, he decided to get up in the middle of the night. He's currently on the west coast of the US. Sandile, it's like 4 o'clock in the morning or something ridiculous. So thank you so much, Sandile, for being with us. He's the Senior Manager for City Research and Policy Advocacy. And it's the Office of Strategic Management at eThekwini Municipality, which is the municipality that governs the city of Durban. There he focused on the use of data as a catalyst for evidence-based strategic decision-making and policy formulation to co-create tools, systems, and processes for improving service delivery and supporting development. So we've got an amazing panel, and as I said, we're torturing them a little bit because they've got only a very limited time to share a wealth of experience. But without further ado, I want to hand over to Blake.
Thanks, Edgar. So we're going to run a quick exercise before the speakers start. As Edgar mentioned, that we are starting a 2-year project between the African Centre for Cities and the Urban Future Studio, where we'll be looking at this theme of sustainable infrastructure and what types of infrastructure we need to proliferate in order to achieve a transition towards these better futures that we'd like to achieve. And in order to start the project, we'd like to make sure that the types of infrastructure we're focusing on are really relevant to the context and what people are most interested to learn more about. So we have put together a short list of 10 different infrastructure themes that we could potentially look at when we start to write up case studies and look for inspiring examples from around the continent. And these themes are green and public space, water, sanitation, waste management, mobility, internet and ICT, education and health, buildings and housing, food and markets, and energy. We'd now like to run a quick poll with all of you in the room to find out which of these you think are the most important themes in need of innovation. Helene, can you pull up the poll on the screen, please? So you should all see on your screen a Zoom poll, which would allow you to choose for those themes that you think are the most important. You can choose multiple themes, and we will show the poll results at the end to give an indication of where the greatest interest and priorities would lie from this audience. I can already see waste management and green and public space coming across as prevalent themes. Water increasing in prominence. Energy also coming up as a prominent theme. We've got 67% have participated, so we'll give a bit more time for the rest to add their views. Waste management and energy now looking like the two most popular themes. Okay, anybody else? We'll do 5 more seconds and then I'll pull up the poll. Okay, great. We've got 83% participation. So that's fantastic. And the poll should now be showing on your screen. And we can see that energy is one of the most prominent themes at 55%, followed by waste management at 53%, water at 47%, and buildings and housing at 42%. So that's really useful. Thank you very much for sharing your views so that we can orient the research around where the interest lies. So we're hoping over the next few months to start on writing up inspiring case studies from around the continent and to be able to share these back to this audience and others at the next Rise Africa and other events. I'm now going to hand back to Edgar to introduce the speakers.
Thanks, Blake. I hope my sound is improved. Not sure what happened. So we're gonna, just to say that when we advertised the event, we were gonna have a 5th speaker, Malika Radojevic from UNDP Innovation. Unfortunately, she had a health emergency this weekend. She's fine, but yeah, she just wasn't able to be with us today. So all of our fantastic panelists have a little bit more airtime once the M-Pesa transaction comes through. But without further ado, let's hear from them. And the order will be, Sandile will kick us off. So we'll kind of start with a fairly macro picture at the metropolitan scale, and then we'll move to Port Harcourt, and then we'll go to Nairobi and end off in, of course, the main hotspot, Accra, with Will. So the floor is yours, Sandile.
Thank you, Edgar. This morning and my proximity where I am reminds me of how profound my native language of Zulu is, that we just greet Sawubona. It doesn't matter whether it's in the morning or the afternoon. So I will say Sawubona because if I say very good morning, it's in the afternoon elsewhere. As Edgar has introduced me in this session, Sandile Mbate is my name and I work for eThekwini Municipality. I'm going to, while talking to you within the next 5 minutes, I will share my screen, and it's a tactic to distract you from what I'm saying by making you look to the other side. My contention today, an argument that I put forward, is that you are not going to be able to make any decisions without knowing the state of the world. I argue that data is infrastructure in itself because it serves as a catalyst, an enabler, in order for you to make sustainable decisions. Without knowing the state of the world, you are almost unlikely to make decisions that make sense. And I know often I am dismissed as a person who's obsessed with data, and colleagues here in the US taught me a saying that in God we trust and everyone brings data. It is not necessarily a perspective I take. I take it from, again, my native tradition of isiZulu that says, you ask the path from those who've traveled it. But how do you ask the path from those who've traveled it in a context of a city planning and infrastructure? You look at the data and how you have performed in the past in order for you to make decisions of the future. The screen that you are seeing, and I'm hoping you see it, you can give me a thumbs up if you see it, thank you so much, is sort of hollowing statistics about what we've gone through the past couple of months, not even a couple of months, in fact it was in May. We had tremendous storms which just came back again the past 3 days. We lost at least 390 lives or more. More people are still missing, presumed dead, because they will know there's likely no survivors after a few weeks of flooding. Major impact on infrastructure. Without knowing this and keeping it in this format, how do you make decisions in the future? So we've had massive infrastructure disruptions. We know where this infrastructure is. How do you then say, this is how we build infrastructure in the future, because we know that the bulk infrastructure was swept away during the flood. And that points to various issues in terms of not working with nature, right? If you put a pipe across a stream that is likely to flood, even in within a 100-year a floodplain, it will be swept away. How do we then start rethinking our infrastructure provision using data itself? So I argue that in fact, I see that, Edgar, you in some of your slides, you're putting digital transformation and data issues right at the bottom. I argue that it's at the top. Without knowing what infrastructure is required and the state of the world, you're going to keep making bad decisions again and again that are completely unsustainable. I don't think that infrastructure itself is a starting point, and then looking at sort of digital tools, because we have the digital tools to tell us spatially what are the issues. As an example, so part of what we've been able to do is looking at our, let me not clutter this, I'll open it for you so that you don't see it cluttered. We've done some work with CSIR, our Center for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, to look at our vulnerable communities. Without this understanding of our populations in terms of where they are located, in terms of the sort of various demographical issues, spatial issues, we are not, again, able to make sound and innovative infrastructure decisions. So I argue again that data is a foundation for making the sustainable infrastructure decisions. As a eThekwini, and we're not there yet. We are working towards that. We've decided that we'll integrate our city level data in order for it to inform our decision making process. Again, we say it's easier to say this, but without a sort of concerted effort to transform government institutions that are by nature designed to fail, in fact designed to be inefficient, and anyone who's worked in any state, in any government, will understand that any government institution is designed not to be sustainable because of the multi-layers of the decision-making process that makes it difficult to even buy a pen. To buy a pen in government, you would rather go and borrow it or beg in the streets than to go through the entire process of purchasing a pen, just as an example. How we then thought about it at the city level, at the Tekwini level, is saying, how do we then push this inefficient system through? Oh, was it birds? Or someone moved?
No, those were real birds for you.
It was real birds. Okay, I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes. So the last part that we've argued about before is, how does data give the citizens or communities the understanding of the state of the world, so they could themselves make informed infrastructure decisions on their own. So there's a lot of work that we've done in that regard, and I was hoping to show you more stuff, more fancy stuff that we do, but we're not doing it because it's nice and colorful. We're doing it because it informs how we make decisions. If you talk about mobility, safe mobility, how do you talk about safe mobility without understanding the patterns in terms of, I mean, we've been told to not use accidents, to use car crashes. So we're going to use car crashes to understand how the interaction between humans and pedestrians and roads cause a lot of infrastructure issues, caused a lot of damages, and we're not going to be able to make informed infrastructural decisions. So I therefore argue that, Edgar, we put infrastructure, we put data and digital tools on top that then informs us how we make that infrastructure decisions that are nature-based, that tells us about the state of the world. Thank you so much for being patient with me, and thanks to the birds.
Thanks, Sandile. That was a great provocation, and to provoke right back. So the idea of putting it at the bottom is to think of it as foundational, right? So you can't kind of do these other things if you don't have that foundation in place. But it's fun to play around with what our spatial associations mean, right? That's interesting that you kind of think that means it's at the bottom, less, as in less priority. But yeah, but great points. Thank you. That was pretty, yeah, those they are beautifully done though. So so apart from them being very informative, your infographics are stunning. So without further ado, we'll go straight on to Michael.
Hello, let me just share my screen. Good morning and afternoon and evening, perhaps. So I find Sandile's idea of data as infrastructure attractive. It's a short leap from there to story as infrastructure. And I've been concerned with both telling urban stories and cities as narrative spaces for some while. There's a story about the future of cities, which we all know. It's a story about the power of stories, and it's one that storytellers often tell. It goes something like this. Humanity's future is urban, and much of humanity's urban future is the future of African cities. Informality is a dominant mode of African urbanism, and this mode fundamentally perturbs the notion of city-level planability. The future African city is both deeply informal and demographically and infrastructurally young. By 2050, being a young, disenfranchised slum dweller is going to be the core urban condition. If large groups in our cities are denied security, a sense of urban belonging, a voice and a view in policy and planning processes, then these policies and plans will inevitably fail in ever more violent ways. Conversely, so the story goes, if overlooked communities can make themselves seen and heard, if they can give voice to their vision of a city in which they're recognized and in which they recognize themselves, then they can change the city's plot. Change the plot in both the narrative sense and change the plot in the spatial sense. This is the story that our work in Port Harcourt is predicated on. And here's a 30-second snapshot of infrastructure of narrative production. Ours is a community-led media, music, architecture, urban design, and human rights initiative. We've built a cluster of platforms: Chikoko Radio, a youth-led community station building citywide audiences; Chikoko Studios, a production facility for young people from marginalized communities to make and share music; Chikoko Cinema, an inflatable mobile cinema putting overlooked people in the picture; and Chikoko Maps, a participatory research and planning program which gives people the power to literally put themselves on the map, articulate different city scales, explore neighborhood histories, tell many stories. As a response to the pandemic, we've developed Viral Times. It's a new online platform of home-based production and an editorial focus exploring the interplay of public health and public space and the ways in which the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. We work with hundreds of young women and men from the city's informal settlements so that they can tell their stories on film, on air, and in court, chart their reality on maps, and describe their visions in action plans. And now, perhaps angling towards a more obvious notion of hard infrastructure, we're developing Chikoko Space, an iconic community arts and advocacy space. Here's some images from the first iteration, how Media Shed, solar-powered production studio and community gathering space that's alight at night. We're not just designing a building, we're building a movement. So the story goes. But this is a story about stories that I'm no longer wholly convinced by. Changing the plot in the narrative sense does not necessarily change the plot in the spatial sense. The map is not the territory, notwithstanding the capacity of maps to produce and reproduce territory. Even though from the outset we set out not just to make media, but also media infrastructures and institutions, this representational space is not adequate to the sheer scale of the challenge that we face. And the challenge is that chronic citywide service delivery failures in places like Port Harcourt are unlikely to be successfully addressed through massive and massively costly centralized infrastructures. Port Harcourt is littered with abandoned infrastructures. And yet we want to change the living conditions for hundreds of thousands of people. And we want this to catalyze change for millions more. Our projects described a narrative that gestures to the city yet to come. Now we want to build it. At what scale can we build to transform a city? And in the face of climate disruption and ecological collapse, which in the staggering environmental depletion of the Niger Delta seem in no way to be future prospects, one sees what is at stake, what the future promises if we do not transform the city. And so the call is urgent. How to imagine and realize a post-oil future in the oil capital of Nigeria. The first step for me has been to zoom up and look down at what is already happening on the ground, how the city is actually being built. In Port Harcourt, 500,000 people live in self-built waterfront communities. They're the fastest growing neighborhoods of the city. And these self-built communities already operate at city scale, albeit through forms of association, all too often devalorized as merely informal. They have tremendous capacity to mobilize, to make, and to manage. And I've been developing a route to scale described through an expanding network of lightweight, low-cost, on-site neighborhood infrastructures and social services embedded in neighborhood association, organizing and managing in ways that draw on, deepen and extend local capacities of auto-construction, self-management, solidarity, cascading upwards. This is an approach to infrastructure design and operation which expresses and encourages relations of mutuality and actively anticipates a regenerative urban ecology. Take electricity, for example, to round up. In a city whose hydrocarbons literally fuel the economy, we're lucky if we get 6 hours of mains power a day. Utility renewable solutions aren't feasible because the existing grid lacks the integrity. Utility level is too big. Yet solar lamps or even household rooftop solar solutions are too small. They can't scale efficiently. So if utility level is too big and household level is too small, what's just right? The neighborhood. Mini grids that can be implemented and managed locally, yet interconnected in ways that can be scaled citywide. In a city where the state cannot provide power, community partnerships can do so in ways that empower. The route to scale is not to make things bigger, but to connect them. Sometimes the big thing is a concert of small things, or perhaps medium-sized things, interconnected mini-grids, on-site water and sanitation solutions, community farms, as well as the social infrastructures that embed these service systems, laying a locally rooted and increasingly extensive network of association and service delivery. Each neighborhood a light at night, a beacon, not merely a one-off demonstration project, but a node and an expanding network. The impacts and reach of this expanding network are amplified by connection to a community media production platform that each node involves, and its rooting in community life is deepened by the public space creation and programming each node catalyzes. So, for example, the solar array for the mini-grid provides shade for the community gathering space, and the solar plant will also power the local radio station. The station will give voice to the vision that literally powers it. These community infrastructures of light and voice are both makers of place and technologies of political imagination, so that the story is indeed part of the story. And I didn't hear any little birdies.
I think they were caged.
I know why you're saying.
For that. Great. So we'll move on to Nairobi. Regina, the floor is yours. And welcome.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. So I'm Jambo and greetings from Nairobi. My name is Regina Opondo and I'm a justice and peace worker. Just doing my little bit to change my city, my country, and hopefully the world by working with amazing people, communities across Kibera, Kenya, and of course, Concrete Design Initiative to build productive public spaces and infrastructure, both physical, and we've heard of data as infrastructure, storytelling as infrastructure, but also for us, civic space as infrastructure. So getting communities to exercise that civic muscle and get into the act of demanding for their rights, exercising their rights, and taking up space. And these communities are often in forgotten, underserved, and under-resourced places. And the dream for all of us is to advance equity and activate the unrealized potential in neighborhoods and in our cities. And for our work as KDI, there are three ingredients that we think are quite critical to successful, sustainable upgrading for informal settlements. And the first is participation, the second is integration, and the third is network change. And for us, participation is key because it is connecting with community members and their priorities. Those that experience the complexities of informal settlements, and particularly Kibera, are the ones that have the right to participate in decisions that are made affecting them and to drive those decisions and to even be involved in implementation and maintenance. So for us, participation is key in all the work that we do. It enables us as KDI to build on local knowledge, increase social cohesion, and help community members grow in their capacity to effect change. And the second is integration, which I think Michael also alluded to in terms of connecting different small initiatives. Connecting different strategies, not just the initiatives, to create a multi-sectoral intervention. Design for us is not enough. It's not sufficient to create the transformation that we want to see in people's lives. But at the same time, we recognize that design can really set the stage for transformation of social and economic initiatives. So our projects, particularly the Kibera Public Space Project, integrates physical infrastructure with income generating activities and sociocultural programming, and each work to support the other elements. And then the third one is network change, which is really about connecting community members with each other, but also with various agencies and connecting community members with government and other actors. So making these connections becomes essential, otherwise the project remains in a silo and the impact becomes limited, but also they're not able to input into the larger synergy of the city or the other investments that are going on in the city. So trying to plug into that as well. So like many informal settlements, Kibera is both a site of extremely challenging conditions and also of innovation, ingenuity, and low impact living. I don't need to go into the details because I think all of us are aware of the challenges of informal settlements. But I think one thing that seems to cut across all informal settlements, whether in Karachi, whether in South Africa, whether in South America, is that they also become sites of hope, sites of innovation, and sites of lots of new exciting things coming out of them. And so for us, while Kibera has these many challenges, Kibera remains home, and Kibera is hopeful, and Kibera is rising. So this is Nairobi Dam a couple of years ago, I think around 2006. And the dam used to be a water source, and initially over the years got flooded. I mean, pollution got polluted, because waste was dumped inside. And some of this waste was semi-solid, such that you could not tell that there was a water body there. So this is a place that people used to swim in the 90s when I was a kid, sailboats in the 80s and that sort of thing. And the communities around there were really suffering. And so in engaging with those communities, the Kibera Public Space Project started here at the Nairobi Dam. It is a direct response for us to the disenfranchisement and the injustice, which is often rooted in our colonial heritage and often repeated by government in its informal settlement development initiatives and policies. So for Site 1, Kibera Public Space 1, working with a new Nairobi Dam community group and starting with them and thinking through what were the challenges, where would we find space to implement an intervention? And the dam became a place to reclaim and revitalize and revive for the community to benefit. So building on the principles that I earlier mentioned of participation, integration, and network change, the Kibera Public Space Project has modeled how people-focused design can enhance our community's socioeconomic status, holistic well-being, strengthen cohesion, and give agency for communities to demand their rights from duty bearers. So from the previous space that we saw before, a dumping site, a place that was not comfortable to use, to a place where there is a hall that the community can use. And this is even an older picture because now we have a play base here, a park that the community can have their meetings outdoors or indoors, urban agriculture. So they also have a farm, they're growing vegetables, they have toilets, and they're also doing plastic recycling. So a lot of activities going on at the site, and they even have a women's group doing arts and crafts, which we are selling to make income. So from one site, KPSP1, we've grown over the years from one public space on reclaimed public land to a network of 11 community managed public spaces in the informal settlement of Kibera. And as you can see, they're all connected to each other, and most of them are along the Ngong River. And with every site, there has been learning, but also testing of new innovations. And just to share one of the innovations, so looking at how we would recycle soda crates, this is site 11, our last and most recent public space at Vuma. And we've used soda crates to improve the porousness of the area because it suffers from flooding. So this helps the water to seep down rather than sit on the surface and then flow into people's homes. And so testing these kind of innovations, working with locally available materials that are not being used and seeing how we can recycle that. And the ideas often come from the community, and that's something that we're excited about. So the KPSPs as a network now serves over 125,000 people, is a home to a dozen small businesses, reduces climate risk through river remediation, climate adapted infrastructure, and community awareness while providing safe water, sanitation, playgrounds sometimes, and services typically only found in the formal parts of Nairobi. And another seed of KDI was that we wanted to develop a model that was flexible enough to be able to be adapted, to be scaled up, and even to travel. So not just restricted to Kibera, but could be taken anywhere. And we've made efforts in documenting, sharing our learnings, and advocating for participatory infrastructure development. And we're even starting to see some of the fruits of this work. Recently, the French Development Agency, working with the government of Kenya, launched the Urban Fabric Initiative. And when we looked at the call for proposal, it looked very similar to the KPSP project, KPSP process, following the same logic. And for that, it is also linked to the Kenya Informal Settlement Improvement Project. And the spirit appears to be that public space, social and cultural layers alongside hard infrastructure is the key. And for us as KDI, we're excited to see this. It's taken 15 years, and we hope to be a part of this process. And we've also tried to push some of this learning into a framework, which we launched last week, to be shared and used by professionals and practitioners, so that it is inclusive, integrated infrastructure upgrading, and we can share more details about that. But alongside that, we also hope to launch a people's guide. So how do communities work with infrastructure upgrading, even if it is not KPSP driven, but taking the lessons we've learned from the KPSP project and from other partners like SDI, Muungano ya Wanavijiji, and putting that into a how to guide for communities and for interlocutors that work with communities. It feels very empowering because communities also need to be prepared. And just to quote Sheila Patel of SDI, when a woman in the slum feels she can hold a professional to account, then we have progress. And that's the change we want to see as KDI. So for us, KPSP is the crazy notion that people in communities, especially in informal settlements, know best what their challenges are and have the capacity to make the decisions and knowledge to develop solutions and implement them. All that is needed is just a little bit of accompaniment. For example, the technical knowledge that KDI brings in our planning expertise, design, construction, research expertise. Public spaces, therefore, can become important sites of testing, learning, and bringing communities together that can catapult a neighborhood or an informal settlement into a better condition with ripple effects, not just for the informal settlement or a particular neighborhood, but for the city at large and hopefully the country and the region. There are sites where more permanent and deeply supported relationships with the physical environment and social networks can be created, where right holders and duty bearers can come together for sustainable informal settlement upgrading. One of the inspirations of the AU Agenda 2063, speaking about a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, and of course linked with SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. In the context of an Africa where a lot of current and future growth is focused on infrastructure, then we must also be innovative about our approaches. We must look to and look after our environment, and we must think about building infrastructure, but most of all, we must think about building resilience, but most of all, we must have people who we are building for and who get affected by the infrastructure in all their diversity, from children, women, men, old, young, etc., be at the heart of sustainable development. So in a conclusion, because it's also Africa Week, I'm inspired by this quote from Thabo Mbeki's speech, I Am an Africa, of 8 May 1996. The evolution of humanity says that Africa reaffirms that she is continuing her rise from the ashes. Whatever the setbacks at the moment, nothing can stop us now. Whatever the difficulties, Africa shall be at peace. Thank you. Asante.
Thanks so much, Regina, for that really inspiring set of examples. So we're running a bit tight on time, so I want to go straight over to Will to share with us from Accra, and then we'll open up for some reflections from the plenary. I'm not sure if you're unmuted, Will. Yeah.
Thanks, Edgar. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So yeah, in a room filled with experts and practitioners like all of you, I'm definitely the fish out of water. So pardon me in so many ways. I happen to have fallen into this pond, this particular one, by accident. I lead the Impact Hub here in Accra, and the Impact Hub, if you know about it, is meant to be a global convener of 3 core communities of people. So your typical hipsters in so many ways, tech entrepreneurs, social impact entrepreneurs, and creatives. So the eclectic bunch in cities across the world. Typically very idealistic, focused on using technology to drive change and new business principles to build communities. In Accra, we had set out to do exactly that nearly a decade ago, but quickly realized that the core infrastructure we were building on was quite rotten in so many ways. And when you convene young people from urban, very active urban communities like what Accra is, you quickly realize that you can't out-innovate their infrastructure. And so it becomes clear to you that in a bid to empower and also give them global resources and access to opportunities, you have to make the city work for them so they can actually build the things they want to build. So a lot of what we set out to do was fairly clear immediately that wasn't going to work without their core infrastructure. So we, after burying our head in the sand for nearly a year and decided not to pursue the heavy lifting, we quickly came to the conclusion that we had to find a way to get around these challenges. So the Impact Hub primarily exists in 110 locations around the world, fairly autonomous institutions in each market, and operate as independent organizations within their own, all our local context. But given the color of what the city looks like, it became quite clear that we had to take a certain path that is fairly different from most impact hubs across the world. So at the heart of impact hubs is a lot of programmatic support, helping entrepreneurs scale ideas, and also bringing capital and people together to make some of these things happen. And we quickly realized that in Accra, we had to take some very different approaches. So it became clear that economic stability in very small clusters was going to be important as a case study for showing the city was possible. So think of it as the social lab of the city of Accra, because we also realized that the economic reality and the political machinations just sometimes don't make large-scale experiments possible. So it's always the right way to show rather than tell. So screaming at politicians, trying to get them to sign documents that commit them to some things is not the right way to go. Showing them what is possible in small scale and inspiring them to take that on is how you get some things done. So we decided that a small part of the city, a historic part of the city, Osuakwaje, was going to be that test bed for us. And we set out to do a number of things. Take underutilized and unused land, high value land that is, raise private capital, and begin a city regeneration tied around these three core communities of creative tech entrepreneurs and social impact entrepreneurs, and begin to let their work translate into the landscape of that community. Now, in that process, we had to identify some of the core things that connect that hipster, for lack of a better phrasing, community and the mass population that is embedded in the city of Accra, because we also realized that we were in some cases talking from a place of privilege, wanting our city to work for young people. But every time we talked about it, we're talking about college-educated young people, ambitious college-educated young people who thought the world was at their beck and call, and they needed some things to happen. But we needed to find a commonality that can connect both that group of people and the mass community, the bigger community. And one of the core ones that we started to quickly realize could unite us was sustainable kind of urban infrastructure, and we latched onto mobility as the uniting force. So what we then went to do was figure out how can these two polar opposite groups of young people begin to work, because obviously at the core of what we are doing will continuously serve these three core that I've talked about. But then there has to be a bridge somewhere. So we set out to figure out what that bridge could be. And it became clear that urban mobility, particularly last mile, last touch distribution, is how we connect as a group. So the guy on the motorbike bringing my food from Jumia Food or Glovo is how do we meet in that middle to be able to have shared language. And it became clear that building e-mobility opportunities within this enclave that will connect the two and bring socioeconomic ties between those two, bring clear advantages to be between those two, was one of the ways to finally be not seen as a peripheral, idealistic bunch of people building an alternative culture on the side. And so we set out to raise capital and build a lot of these charging stations. One second. Battery dying. And
William, just
now
you've got 5 minutes. Unfortunately, the birds didn't sound. I don't
the
think
birds
they
are
can-
singing. The birds are singing. I'm being Oscar played off. But the point is that over time, we figured out how to use these interconnecting opportunities to start defining how our urban spaces work, where the charging stations go, how do people access them, and all of these things. And in the process, build a new urban economy that works for all the classes that we've talked about. In the as we build, these are the core components of the work that we are doing. How do we incubate commercial opportunities in this enclave, mature opportunities, but more recently, our biggest focus has been how to make micro distribution and last touch opportunities within these communities a meeting point for all young people to actually build new urban economies. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Amazing. That's such a rich set of examples there. And what I really appreciated about all four presentations was the sense of process and exploration and searching that you all reflected on. So thanks for bringing that sense of process into the conversation. So we've got one question in the chat already. We're going to go straight open, and I'm going to encourage you to please write your questions there. If you want to pose them, you can also use the raise your hand function in Zoom, and I will try and spot you and ask you to raise your question. So Sushi Johanna, if I pronounced that correct, my apologies if I haven't, from Utrecht University, has two questions for all the speakers. Firstly, what should be the desirable futures for informality in Africa? Are we imagining it becoming formal? And secondly, to what extent digital platform innovation influences the informal economy and or institutions in Africa? And if we see it as viable, can it actually reduce inequality, or will it worsen that? So I think we'll need another hour for all four speakers to answer both questions. So, so you have freedom to pick one of those and share a quick reflection, and then we'll wait for more questions to come in or for hands to be raised. Please, the floor is yours, panelists. Don't all go at once.
Who wants to go first?
So just to say, well, I forgot to say earlier, you obviously were far too apologetic about hipsters, right? I mean, look at Michael's beard. You know, the panel is so with you. Michael, on that note, do you want to take us on?
I mean, first thing I think that's worth pointing out is that what we term as informality is, of course, something that's characterized by many forms. It's formal in many different ways. It's informal only to the extent often that it isn't state sanctioned. And so I'm not sure that formalization as such or central state sanctioning is the necessary telos. I think what one would want to achieve is a way of increasing the interoperability of these different formalities, increasing their transparency and capacity to interact with each other so that you can get communication and exchange across different localities. And drawing on the strengths of informality, which is an extreme responsiveness, an improvisatory and experimental edge, and a rooting in place. So as I said, I think maybe extending digital platforms of various kinds are ways of achieving this without formalization. So for example, you know, blockchain isn't the universal panacea by any means, but it's a way of recording various kinds of transactions which have been considered informal and allowing them to interact with other kinds of systems.
Thanks, Michael.
To the point of...
Come in, Will, and then deal after you. That's fine.
Yes. To the point of what extent digital platform innovation can influence informal economy and institutions in Africa, and can you reduce inequality? I'm of the mind that yes, especially given what I've seen in our own small experiments. So let me give an example. The gig economy that is blowing up all across Africa and creating opportunities for out-of-work young people to get daily wages is one example of some sort of informality meets formality, because the platforms that create these things are formal large tech businesses but the way they engage with these gig workers is in some ways informal. There are opportunities to use that formality meets informality to create data that can elevate these gig economies and kind of bring them into the mainstream. So for example, in Ghana, there's a company called Leapfrog that is essentially using gig economy backend data to provide credit data so that these people can afford certain things like housing, better housing, small credit for better housing, and live closer to cities and get better opportunities. So there is an opportunity for digital platform innovation to slowly influence how informal sector workers live and improve lives, for sure. The question is who is building it and what is the intent? It's always a good question for us.
Sorry, Sandile, before you come in, just in the interest of fairness, so we're scheduled to end in 4 minutes, but we'll go over by about 10, so we'll go till 2:40. So for those who have to drop off at 2:30 because of other commitments, we totally understand, but of course we know you're all going to stay because this is so riveting. Sandile.
Thanks, Edgar. It's a very provocative question, and I think it comes from not Susie. It's not Susie's problem, but it's a problem of the world and cities in general, or governments in general, of thinking that formality or formal businesses are the way to go. In fact, very few people use formal processes or engage in formal activities. So it is a very sort of naive way of thinking from the state, from generally us as researchers, to believe that in fact there's a problem with informality. So I know I work for the state, and often I clash with my colleagues because they think we should formalize informal businesses and formal activities. My belief is that you can increase efficiency because these are the spaces that are more inclusive. There's very less barrier for entry for a lot of other people. Informal or formal spaces or economic activities, they failed in many ways because a lot of people are unemployed because they're waiting to get into those formal spaces or formal activities. So I do contend that I think for me, you create an enabling environment, and that enabling environment is saying how do we increase efficiencies of informal activities, but not by limiting it or bylaws that we put on informal traders as an example, or prohibitions that we put on informal selling of properties and so forth. So we need to change the attitude and realize that informality is here to stay in cities, and all we could do is to increase those efficiencies, as some of my colleagues have highlighted. I think it's a very important question, but I think we need to change the attitude also. But who says it's informal? And I'm yet to meet a mother or a father who trades in the streets calling their activity informal. We impose this, and Michael has touched on it. We really impose these sort of phrases that of course disenfranchises almost completely the activities of low-income communities and middle-income communities in the world. Thanks, Edgar.
Thanks, Sandile. Really helpful. So there's some great reflections and comments in the chat box. We are harvesting all of that. It was very much going to inform how we map out the project going forward. We obviously can't get to all of those questions now. I just wanted to check with Regina. Did you want to come in on any of those points or any of the other questions in there?
Yes, actually, I wanted to speak to the question of digital platforms. And it's a question we've asked ourselves, especially looking at the exclusion that happens for communities in informal settlements when it comes to digital space. And it was more so glaring, I think, during the COVID-19 experience when everybody went online, and without access, without the infrastructure, then these communities were left further behind. So one of the things we've been piloting for the last year or so in Kibaya, and using the KPSPs as a point to catapult this off, is a project called Living Data Hubs, where we use the KPSPs, 5 of them, to install infrastructure, and working with a local community network, internet community network provider, Tunapandanet, to then put in place infrastructure for internet, but then work with the communities to look at three things. So one is how do you use that internet to collect data, own data, manage the data, because people come in, collect data about the communities and go out and it never comes back to the communities. So how do we put them at the forefront of data collection and data use? And looking at data in different ways. So looking at using the internet to host maybe sensors around quality of air, and we put a couple of air quality sensors around that, but also to launch surveys and to collect information, but also to pass messaging. Secondly was how do you build capacity to then use that infrastructure and use it in a way that people can access information, can access education, but it also can create socioeconomic opportunities. So whether it is reselling internet or providing internet access to the community that is around the public site. The government has also recently launched a scheme around digital employment, but you'd have to be connected to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. So this also creates a second avenue for income generation for these particular communities. So just to speak a little bit about that and to share that, and I'll share the links about the Living Data Hubs project. It's still in pilot phase, but hopefully we can see how we can bridge that digital divide, but also add other infrastructure, not just digital infrastructure, using the KPSPs as a launching pad for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. Michael, is that a new hand or?
Yeah, it's a new hand. I mean, just briefly to speak to the question about scale, I think one of my points is that the route to scale is not necessarily to make things big, is to create a concert of small things and to focus on the ways in which cities are already being built, which is at neighborhood level. And that, I think, also speaks to management and maintenance capacity, because these communities have real capacity to mobilize, make, and manage. And if that capacity is drawn on in ways that increase efficiency, then I think you can achieve citywide scale by interconnecting neighborhood networks.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to draw everyone's attention to Josie's comment that there is a form, a Google Docs form that we'd appreciate you fill out if you want to stay informed about how this project evolves. So yeah, so if you give us your details, we'll add you to the database and keep you engaged. So we're running tight of time, so without further ado, and I have, as I said, there's fantastic contributions in the chat function. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them now, which I think just underscores why this project is so important. Many dimensions to explore. I just want to ask my colleague Martin Heyer from Utrecht University to share a couple of reflections as we close, listening across the conversation and the inputs, and then I'll close us off after that. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Edgar, and thanks for a fantastic first workshop on this issue of sustainable urban infrastructures. I thought that were a few common threads that were shared in the talks and also in the questions. So it's a different perception of infrastructure, also perhaps a bit different from the way we sort of outlined it at the beginning in the wording of. There's a lot of soft infrastructure in the talks, so about the use of public space, the need to have good data. I mean, so data of course requires hard infrastructure, but it is also about knowing what's going on and how to and about being able to share knowledge. So I think for me that's immediately then a question: to what extent do we want to pursue sort of the latest, like these digital twins, or is it precisely about knowing how we've been sharing information so far and perhaps extend the information in a network structure like we are doing currently right now? So sharing across examples. So second sort of element that I thought was very prevalent is the idea of an experimental city, rather than a blueprint city. These were clearly experiments that tap into the learning capacity from neighborhoods and the like. And of course, again, that the idea, if you have such a thing as an impact hub, would be really neat to see if you can create an infrastructure by putting that in a network, right? In a network of other infrastructure hubs, so that you share information, but that then is not necessarily data in the, say, the digital sense. Sandeel's beautiful presentation is also, I mean, later on in the discussion, I think we got a good connection again to the fact that if people do have the mobile phone devices that are appropriate for the data generation, then the old hurdle may be overcome, namely that it's very difficult to get good data. So a dashboard is a nice idea, but how do you populate it? That's, I mean, and very easily, if all the money that would be available could go into creating good statistics. But of course, if you can build up a sort of a bottom-up system that populates that dashboard that you share, then of course it's a very different story, because it can actually be a resource for great many people more. And of course, it was noticeable the idea of self-built community cooperatives as sort of the building stones of this whole endeavor. I think also that we should be very careful to keep taking into account. Now, the final point, of course, is narrative. I mean, these were all, I mean, and that's of course something we found also in the book that we did on neighborhoods recently. I mean, good neighborhoods tend to have a narrative, so they have a common narrative, and so a narrative can actually become sort of a positive force to create a better infrastructure, because it gives you a focus in what you want to do. So, by and large, thank you very much for a lot of information. I haven't been able to read through all the chat, but we will document that and analyze it. So back to you, Edgar.
Thanks, Martin. Appreciate it. And yeah, so just all that remains for me is to just thank the core team, Josie, Blake, and Bella, for making sure we all be here and that we are compliant with ICLEI's fantastic platform. And thanks to the ICLEI team for making sure all the technical issues were lined up. And then enormous gratitude to the 4 speakers who've shared generously, and we wish we had a day. I think it would be nice to have a good hour and a half on each of your cases to really pick through the detail. And I suspect both the fun and the complexity and the learning sits in the detail. So you will not escape us so easily. We will be re-engaging you to drill down deeper. And I think that it was amazing to me how the 4 inputs really aligned and spoke to each other and amplified points across the 4 cases, which kind of gives me, you know, hope that as someone who's an urbanist interested in African cities, that we can actually also speak beyond the specificities, that there are some common themes and threads that can help us make sense of our emergent collective Pan-African experience. And then, of course, the audience have stuck it out with us. We had very little drop off, and we had a fantastic first sort of group of people engage with us. Thanks for your comments in the chats. We will read them all carefully, and I'll make sure Martin also reads all of them very carefully. And they'll definitely help us understand what the research design is going to look like. Final point, we will be advertising on the ACC platforms really soon. 2 postdoc positions that is going to help us do the empirical work for this project and pick up on a lot of the themes you've mentioned. So please keep a lookout for that. And if you know just the right person who is incredibly well positioned to do amazing work, please make sure that they apply. So within the next week or 2, we'll advertise those positions. So make sure you follow us on our various platforms and you won't miss a thing. So thank you so much, and have a fantastic Rise Africa Festival for the next 2 days. Bye-bye.